Hey everybody, this is herculespetix, founder, curator, docent, and gift shop employee of the herculespetix Academy of Comic Book Studies. Today we're going to be looking at the Rocketeer Adventure Magazine, number 1 through 3. The second part of our look at all the Rocketeer stories by Dave Stevens. This just continues the wondrousness of that first graphic novel that we looked at last episode. There's a huge gap in between that graphic novel, the collection of all the Rocketeer short stories, and this comic. Eclipse Comics went out of business, and so there's a 3-year gap in between the last Eclipse collection and the first issue of this Comico version of the Rocketeer. Let's check these out. So this came out in 1988. I gotta say, guys, this is one of the most beautifully designed covers, maybe of all time. I love this so much. I mean, the art's just beautiful, beautiful painted Dave Stevens cover. But then all of this business going on, and the great logo, even the price in the first issue, the old-timey font, this Art Deco font, just beautiful. It says that the art director is Rick Taylor, so maybe he's responsible. But overall, just love this cover. We have a little introduction from Dave Stevens, and let's get into the comic. So we start off with, we see the Rocketeer flying over a city, and these policemen gun him down. And we see the Rocketeer falling out of the sky, dying. And then we hear Betty. Turns out it's just a dream of Betty's. I did want to mention the colors are by Henry Mayo with Dave Stevens. Henry Mayo did a lot of coloring for Eclipse, and he was one of those early adopters of like a more painterly style, like just playing with colors a lot more than just the typical 4-color comic format. So we see Betty wake up. She's on the plane to New York City with Marco of Hollywood. And she can't get Cliff out of her mind. She's really missing him. She's not sure if she made a mistake. But she also wants to make a career. And Marco can do a lot for that career, so she's torn. Now we see an airfield somewhere in Hicksville. Literally, the town is Hicksville. I love this opening, very Alex Toth-like panel. And we see Cliff flying his stubby little plane into this tiny little airstrip to get some more gas. He's just desperate. He's been flying nonstop since LA. I need gas as fast as you can pour it. He goes inside to get a sandwich and some coffee. And he has a nice little chat with the airstrip owner's wife. And then he heads out. Meanwhile, in some swank New York nightclub, Marco and Betty are hanging out with some other swell heads. And when Betty goes to the bathroom, what we suspected is proven. One of his buddies, his oi polloi buddies, says, "Oh my God, where did you find her?" And he basically, the way he talks about Betty, it's like he's just going to use her. He's like, "Yeah, she's been pretty stubborn. She's been a tough nut to crack, but, I'm sure she'll be fun for a little time or whatever, She'll be good for a few more laughs." So Betty goes in the bathroom. I guess there's a phone in the bathrooms back then in clubs. And she's trying to reach Peavy to see what's going on with Cliff. She's really worried about him. And now she's really starting to regret her decision. She's like, I shouldn't have left. Cliff needed me. Now we're at a Long Island airstrip. Cliff lands his plane, and he's met by an old friend, Goose. And I guess these guys have known each other since childhood. I really like this Goose character. He's just a goofball. And he drives Cliff into the city. Cliff kind of tells Goose about Betty, how he met her, and how so worried he is that ever since she won a beauty contest, she's had all these fancy pants sniffing around her. I like this little montage panel here. So basically they're checking out every fancy club in New York. He figures that Marco and Betty will be in one of those. And they hit pay dirt. Cliff pretends to be a taxi cab driver so he can get in. They won't let him into the club, but he shows a picture of Betty, and the guy's like, yeah, she's here, but you can't go in. So he grabs the guy and basically drags him into the alley and takes his fancy suit so he can get into the club. And he pops in and finds Betty. That's a great panel there, where Betty hasn't seen him in days, Marco shows up. Of course, they start arguing. Betty's just like, oh, I can't take this, Cliff. And Cliff and Marco start fighting. God, that's a good panel with the tilted camera. And Marco's friends grab Cliff, and he starts, not sucker punching him, but like while he's being held, he starts beating him up. Betty stops him, or tries to stop him, but then this mysterious character shows up and grabs his fist. And it seems like he knows the whole situation, this guy with a very big nose. And he says, I loathe parasites such as you preying on naive young women. Like, he already seems to know the whole situation. I know all your dirty secrets, Markovich. Now go. So it turns out that this guy knows Goose, this mysterious figure. In fact, Goose mentioned him earlier. He says, hey, I know this rich guy, he needs a pilot. But Cliff turned him down. Cliff doesn't give a shit about anything except finding Betty. So they take him to the taxi, and Cliff basically pushes Betty away. And, God, it's beautiful right there. And Betty's left alone with this mysterious character. And Goose drives off with Cliff. And of course, Goose is all like, dude, you blew it. What the fuck was that, you moron? And I'm going to give it away because it's not like, but you could tell this is the Shadow. So they had Doc Savage in the first graphic novel. And this guy's kind of supposed to be the Shadow. Little doppelganger. So Cliff tries to explain himself. It's like, oh, she just wanted to come with me out of pity. Fuck that. I mean, Cliff's an idiot at times. Look at this, guys. This is why Dave Stevens did so many covers for comic companies. So just to rub salt in his own wound, Cliff goes to the docks the next day to try and see Betty, and as she gets on her cruise ship. And she doesn't show up. They see Marco, but Betty's not there. And we see why. Because Betty's at an airport, and she's heading back to Los Angeles. Of course, Cliff doesn't know any of this. Look at that. So there is a poster of this, which I wish I had on my wall. And then this is a kind of a part of this new comic is articles about famous aviators. And this is about George Townsend. He was an autogyro pilot. An autogyro will feature in this story. That's why there's all these articles about autogyros. They were like the earliest helicopters. And then we have a backup story in every issue. This is from the Starstruck series. This is like a little spin-off. And it features, what's her name? I think her name was Drusilla the Muscle. She's a character from Starstruck. So the story is by Elaine Lee, of course, who created Starstruck, and art and colors by Michael Kaluta. Pencil art, and inks by Charles Vess. I don't think Vess has ever inked Kaluta before. In fact, Vess doesn't ink many people. He usually just draws his own stuff. But kind of interesting seeing Kaluta and Vess, even though I just see Kaluta. It doesn't look that different to me. So Brucilla's hanging out with the little girl guides. They're like the Girl Scouts in the science fiction world. And she's basically telling stories about her childhood when she was a galactic girl guide. So these are almost like kid gang stories. They're kind of fun. They're definitely played for laughs. And we see young Brucilla with her two fellow girl guides, and they're trying to get their next badge, which they basically have to make a robot. And they make this robot that can, almost like a tennis ball machine, but for badminton. And basically they get this egg clone thing. I guess in the future, like, chickens and eggs are very rare, but they have duplicators. So they put it on top. And of course something goes wrong. Kind of Sorcerer's Apprentice, like, this machine gets out of control. Starts just shooting eggs everywhere. I never really got into Starstruck. Elaine Lee, I can tell that, like, she's a good writer in a way. Like, you know, she's not writing pablum. But something about her storytelling, I don't know, it never engages me. So I never liked the Starstruck, even though I wanted to like it because I had the Mike Kaluta art. And I kind of want to like this more than I do. It's kind of a cute story, though. But of course, things go haywire. The eggs start hatching with actual chickens in them. And then there's all these chickens running around. It's just a bunch of, like, slapstick humor. And then, of course, their girl guide leader shows up and dresses them down and punishes them. We see them with pillows on their butts because she obviously spanked them. So this is one of the pinups from that Rocketeer special edition I mentioned last issue, the one that Eclipse published. And there's other pinups, though, which I don't have. Like I said, I regret getting rid of that. But this is a beautiful Mike Kaluta piece. I love this. Really nice stuff. And this is so sad to me. Here's the next issue page, which I normally wouldn't give much attention to. But this is a Mike Kaluta drawing of the Rocketeer. It's kind of tiny there. But look at this amazing drawing. And then it doesn't appear anywhere else. So I don't know what this was from. Maybe this was a pinup in something that I don't have. I don't know. But it's beautiful. And I would love to see it bigger and in color. That would be nice. And then we have a backup by Kaluta and Vess. A back cover, I mean to say. Number 2. Look at this cover. So this is Dave Stevens, but then he got Dave Dorman to paint over it. And Dave Dorman, you know that he's done tons of Star Wars art. We looked at his Rail comic got a year ago. And just a really, you know, a good painter. He did a bunch of comic covers in the 90s and, well, 80s and 90s. Another introduction. So this issue is interesting. I guess Dave Stevens was running out of time. So Mike Kaluta does all the page breakdowns in this story. And I kind of don't like it as much. It still looks beautiful. But I can almost tell that, like, yeah, that's Dave Stevens had his own great way of storytelling. Mike Kaluta does too. But you can tell the difference. And this is basically co-scripted by Paul DeMeo and Danny Bilson, who ended up co-writing the screenplay of the Rocketeer movie a few years later. So it's weird that they're not even credited except in this little introduction. Kind of strange. It sounds like they wrote it. So now we see Goose and Cliff hanging out. And the shadow guy shows up again. His name's Mr. Jonas. Totally scares the shit out of Cliff. Or really beautiful, just faces. Look at that. It's just gorgeous. I think the colors in this are by Henry Mayo and Dave Stevens again. So basically, God, I forgot his name already. Sorry, Jonas. Mr. Jonas is, wants to hire Cliff. He gives him a whole bunch of money, and Cliff agrees to take the job. So here's that auto gyro. Look at that beautiful vista of the city. That's really nice. So he instructs Cliff to go into this underworld bar. And he's going to meet this guy. Seems like a criminal. And it's one of Jonas's operatives. So just like Doc Savage, the Shadow had a bunch of operatives who always worked with him. And unfortunately, right then, the guy that he was imitating, this operative, he shows up, the real guy. And so, of course, it's like, uh-oh. But then he pulls out a gun, the operative, knocks out the lights. And I love this little sequence where Cliff runs to the staircase. It's this big winding staircase. And the thugs are about to tackle him. And he just thrusts his engines right up all the way to the upper stories. And lands, kind of crash lands into the 13th floor. So he breaks into the room and he finds a picture of a little person, what used to be called the midget. And he says, Tina. He knows who she is. And it turns out Jonas was that operative the whole time. He's pulling off his makeup. He said, you set me up. But Jonas has a reason. He says, you knew the guy staying in this room. And I need the truth about him. This snapshot was taken years ago. So this is back in 1928 when Cliff worked at a circus. Turns out that Jonas found out that all of these guys have been killed over the past few months. The only ones left alive are a couple guys are left alive. And all of them are found with their spines snapped. So Jonas has been on the tail of this guy, whoever this is, the one who's been killing all these circus people. And he figured that this was the last guy standing as far as he knew. But this guy escaped. This perp. And Jonas says, you're the next and last victim. Why? And Cliff says, there's someone who wasn't in this picture. Orsino, the escape king. So there's a ruckus outside the door. So Jonas basically says, take off. I'll keep these guys at bay. I love the coloring here in this dark section where everything, it's kind of dark. Some amazing, beautiful stuff. He hooks up with Goose in the auto gyro. And when the gangsters break down the door, Jonas is gone. So Orsino's playing at Atlantic City. Somehow Goose looked it up, figured it out. And so they're heading over there to intercept Orsino. We see Orsino. He's doing his act at a casino. And he says, "I'd like a volunteer from the audience." And we see just this silhouette. Look at that face. God, Dave Stevens is somehow getting even better. And this is the volunteer. Look at all these great faces. Hey, that's Peter Lorre. Oh, I wonder, I didn't even think about that. I wonder how many of these other guys are famous actors. That's obviously that actor where I always forget his name, but he had that disease. I can't remember how to say it. But it seems like he pops up in comics all the time. Well, doppelgangers of his. So now we see another article about, this is the guy who invented the autogyro. Pitcairn. And now we have another backup of the Galactic Girl Guides. This time it's just Michael Kaluta solo on the art. And so we see another story of young Drusilla. This is kind of like a little Lulu comic, because we got the boy, like the Cub Scout equivalents in the future. And it's like a little war between the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts. So it's just shenanigans. The boys are trying to sneak up on the girls' camp. They set a trap for the boys. Excuse me, guys. And the whole time they're getting ready for like the soapbox derby, but I think it's called like the soup can derby or something like that. They have to basically build some kind of craft and race it. This crazy craft with wings and a big spring, kind of just bounces around. I didn't mention that this is a John Workman taking over the lettering, but I can't help notice that it's like, oh yeah, that's John Workman lettering, incorporating the sound effects with the art. It almost looks like you're reading a Walt Simonson comic. So more hijinks ensue. I'm sorry I'm not describing these stories very well, but I just really don't care. They're kind of fun. But it's just basically a gag. The art's really nice though. Oh, they include this, build your own rocket. Kind of fun. It's like a Chris Ware type thing. And then we have a coming attraction for the next issue, and another back cover by, this time just by Kaluta, of another one of the Galactic Girl Guides. And now we have, unfortunately, the last issue. And so there's a huge gap in between that second and third issue. This is like 6 years later. This is 1995. The second issue was 89. This is 95. And once again, we have this is interesting. It's Paul Chadwick, and his name is first, so I think he's pencils, and then Dave Stevens painted over it. Obviously, those guys know each other from the film industry. And Paul Chadwick of Concrete fame, if you don't know his work. And never liked Paul Chadwick as much as art-wise. So this cover isn't as cool as the last two. It's a little lackluster. And so we find out why there's been such a lag. Because Comico went out of business. The Rocketeer feature film came out. They had to move to Dark Horse. And And I guess there was an earthquake in his neighborhood, and his house was kind of demolished. So this continues the Michael Kaluta breakdowns. Also, this one just says that there's some scripting help from Paul DeMeo and Danny Bilson. But on top of that, apparently there's additional penciling from Arthur Adams and Sandy Plunkett. So man, Dave Stevens just had some of the best cartoonists in the world were his buddies. And I guess because he was so good, he probably, game finds game, or whatever that saying is. I'm an old man. I don't know these things. So the autogyro with Goose and Cliff arrive in Atlantic City. They arrive at the theater where Orsino's playing. This looks so nice. And I think this is still Henry Mayo colors. And meanwhile, on the stage, of course, Orsino recognizes this guy, Lothar. He was the strong man in the circus. And he says, I won't kill you. There's too many witnesses. But do your trick if you dare. And look at that face. So he puts him in the sarcophagus, closes it, turns him into a mummy. But of course, it's all a trick. And he's actually behind the sarcophagus, and he breaks out. And everyone in the crowd is booing. They're like, what a phony. But then the guys who worked there, the stagehands, realize this guy's not supposed to be there. So they try to attack him. He just beats the shit out of him. And then he starts climbing up this rope. And totally unexpectedly, Cliff is already up there. Cliff and Goose. And he's like, you. And of course, Cliff is like, Lothar. And Orsino cuts the rope. So Lothar goes crashing not only through the floor, but all the way down into the water. Because this is on the dock, this club. So Orsino seems pretty unfazed by all this. And just says, oh, Cliff, good to see you. I need a drink. Let's go talk. So now they sit down with Goose, and we see a big flashback about young Cliff working at the circus. And he was the assistant to Orsino. And Lothar would stand there in his Grim Reaper mask, holding the clock that would show how long Cliff had oxygen in his lungs for. So Cliff would basically put himself in danger, and then Orsino would free him just in time. That was the act. And then we see Tina here, one of the sideshow midgets. And she's just pretty much in love with Cliff. She adores him. But Lothar adores Tina. And Tina invites Cliff over to her what do you call them? Her trailer for dinner. And Cliff is barely listening because he's looking at this woman named Ruby. She's given him the eye, and he's totally into her. And you can tell why. So he's not even really listening to her, but he's like, yeah, I'll be there. But of course, he hooks up with Ruby. Tina's left in her trailer all alone with a giant turkey. Stood up. God, the way he draws women. Look at that face. That is just hot. So, of course, Tina's very sad. She actually goes to the trailer and she sees Ruby and Cliff together. And then she runs into Lothar. And just says, hey, Lothar, you want to help me finish this dinner? And so because of all his shenanigans with Ruby, Cliff is late for his act. And Orsino's like, where the hell is that kid? And Tina volunteers. She says, I'll do the act. I've seen it enough time. times. I love this pinhead. This dog-faced boy. So Orsino says, sure, we'll give it a try. But Tina dies. Her tiny lungs couldn't hold enough air. Of course, Lothar is just like, no. Lothar cracked. He went straight for Cliff's throat. It took 3 carnies to pull him off, and he killed one of them, and he went to Sing Sing for it. So they just thought they'd never see Lothar again. And basically that night, Cliff left the circus for good. You can really see the Kaluta breakdowns in this. So even though he just had some guy try to kill him, Orsino and Cliff and Goose kind of hit the pier, the boardwalk, and they just want to have a good time. They hook up with some 3 ladies, and they go into the house of death, and we see Lothar sneaking into the house of death. And Cliff is riding with this woman. Of course, he's not really macking on her because he's thinking about Betty. And Lothar yanks him out of the boat and starts to kill him. He says, for Tina, your debt is paid. So it looks like Cliff is dead, like he drowned him. He says 1 murderer remains. So basically he blamed everyone at the circus. That's why he killed them all, because everyone was encouraging Tina to do the act. God, this art isn't... You can also see the Arthur Adams in this. It's the detail. And so I guess Cliff isn't quite dead. And meanwhile, Lothar is trying to find Orsino. He lights the place on fire, Lothar does. And the whole place is going up in flames. So we see Goose and the 2 women and Orsino climbing up this spider web, this fake spider web, trying to escape the fire. And they're kind of trapped up high on this thing, so they jump down into the water because the flames are getting too close. Man, this art is so slick. And this whole house of death, fun house, whatever, tunnel of love type thing, it's going up in flames. And then Jonas shows up in his autogyro. And he picks up Cliff and he gives him his jetpack. So Cliff goes into the place, goes to the rescue. And the whole place is on fire, like it's an inferno. He's looking for Orsino and Goose. And Lothar attacks him. And then Orsino shows up. And distracts Lothar enough so Cliff can get the upper hand. He basically activates his jet and starts ramming Lothar against the walls and the ceiling. And they crash through the ceiling, and Lothar is stuck, and he's burning. He's like, help me. And it looks like he's actually trying to help Lothar. But then Lothar says, I'll take you to hell with me, and grabs him by the throat. And then he falls finally into the flames to his doom. And when he looks down to see, or to basically see how Orsino's doing, it turns out Orsino is really Jonas. I don't think it was the whole time, but when Orsino shows up in the fire. And then we see Cliff's friends and the 3 ladies. They're escaping in a rowboat. So the next day in a hotel room in Manhattan, it seems like Goose rescued his helmet. And He basically says, thanks for all the help, Goose. But I think it's time I went home and settled things with the government. Sort things out with the law. And he also says, give my thanks to Mr. Jonas. And then we cut back to LA, to the Bulldog Cafe. And Peavy's hanging out there, talking to Millie. And they get a telegram from Cliff. Peavy got a telegram from Cliff saying that he flew out this morning. But he says, interesting though, not a word about Betty. And Peeve imagines that he was too late and Betty's on her way to Europe. But then he hears a voice, a familiar voice. And it's Betty. And of course she's dressed like this, just to give us a nice last page here. And she says, Paris will have to wait. And she says, meanwhile, we got a lot of talking to do. And as far as I know, this is the end of the Rocketeer saga, which doesn't really end the story. We don't get to see Cliff and Betty reunite. It's a damn shame. But then again, IDW collected all the Rocketeer like in an omnibus in the 2000s, sometime in the 2000s. And I should get that. But I don't know if there was some other story. I'm pretty sure, though, there was no other Rocketeer after this. It is interesting that in the editorial, they kind of imply that this comic was going to continue, but almost it would be like a almost anthology title where other artists and writers would take on the Rocketeer. Basically, Dave Stevens was saying, like, yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. I got this movie out. I could do other stuff in Hollywood. But I do want the Rocketeer to continue, but I'll just get other artists and writers to do it. Which, I guess 20 years later or something, IDW did put out that comic. There was a Rocketeer Adventures comic that had all these various writers and artists taking on the Rocketeer. Here we have a gallery, and I don't know who this is. I would guess Sandy Plunkett for some reason. Oh, no, this is Plunkett. Wait, does it say at the bottom here? It doesn't say for some reason. This is Sandy Plunkett. Not really showing off how good Sandy Plunkett could be. Definitely not my favorite, but I mean, you can just see the craft here, just the water. Sandy Plunkett's one of the most unheralded comic artists of all time. So good. Paul Gulacy? I like when Paul Gulacy uses the, whatever it's called, craft tint or whatever. And look at this beauty, Mike Mignola. I think this is right around the time Hellboy was starting. And then we have an in memoriam, Doug Wildey. I guess he just recently died. So there's PV for you. And we have a beautiful back cover by Dave Stevens. Look at that. That is so nice. Beautifully painted cover. So there you go, guys. Rocketeer Adventure Magazine, number 1 through 3. I hope you guys liked looking at them. And it just makes me sad that this was never really finished and that Dave Stevens died. Because even if he didn't do the Rocketeer ever again, his art was so beautiful. And I like his writing too, to be honest. I'd read a comic that he just wrote because he writes fun, entertaining comics. Okay, I guess that's it for today's video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time here at the herculespetix Academy of Comic Book Studies.